The teachers at a prestigious music school constantly neglected the quiet cleaning lady, Naomi Ellis. When a crisis arises during an important concert, they force her to play an impossible piece on the piano. They have no idea that this modest woman, whom they have so despised, is actually one of the most talented pianists in the world. At the Ellington Music School, where future virtuosos carved their names in the air with crescendos and cadences, and ambition rang louder than modesty, no one paid attention to the cleaning ladies who wandered through the polished corridors and rehearsal rooms like background noise, their movements unnoticed, their presence unregistered, and among them was a woman named Naomi Ellis, 32 years old, quiet by nature. Dressed in a gray uniform with faded sleeves and a belt cinched at the waist, wearing soft shoes that were no louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights, with her head always slightly bowed beneath a neatly folded kerchief, her eyes alert but never provocative, thoughtful but always downcast, because in Ellington, power belonged to those who played the piano, and those who washed the floors were expected their thoughts would be as clean and quiet as the marble tiles they scrubbed. Most of the students didn't know her name. To them, she was just a quiet girl who cleaned up after their talents and collected forgotten sheet music, like a ghost gathering discarded works of genius, never lingering, never interrupting. Always listening with such profound silence that she became invisible, and if they ever noticed her long, confident fingers or the way her eyes lingered on an open music stand, they said nothing, because in their world, uniforms meant simplicity, not history. And Naomi wore hers like armor. When Dr. Cynthia Barrett, the head of the piano department, with her sharp voice and even sharper gaze, passed her in the hallway, she didn't slow down. "Miss Ellis," she said sharply, without stopping, "the piano in Studio 2 is dusty again. Do you even know how much it costs?" "Yes, ma'am," Naomi replied calmly, already turning toward the studio before the second insult could reach her. "And use a proper rack. You left stains last time." "Yes, ma'am." She didn't flinch. She never flinched. She was used to that tone, sharp, businesslike, imbued with the assumption that someone in her position couldn't possibly understand what she was touching, let alone what it meant. But when she entered Studio 2 and saw the instrument gleaming in the warm daylight, something shifted in her chest, not quite a memory, but something like it. On the music stand lay Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, opened at the coda, wild, feverish, born of a storm, and Naomi stared at the page, her eyes following the contours of the notes, as if tracing the face of a long-gone person. Her gloved fingers twitching involuntarily, her muscles remembering what her mind was trying to forget, because this piece had once belonged to her in another life, it lived in her bones, roared in her blood. Burned her fingers until silence was the only way out. She didn't hear someone approach. "Miss Ellis," a voice sounded behind her. It was Professor Hal Rosen, an elderly composition teacher with a kind face, always wearing a slightly crooked bow tie, with a voice softer than most. "Are you all right?" "Yes, sir," she replied quickly, pulling her hands away from the keys as if they had betrayed her. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, coming closer. "I was just surprised to see you, looking at a Chopin score." Naomi smiled faintly at him, just enough to end the conversation. "I like the way it looks." He looked at her over his glasses. "Have you ever played?" "No, sir." He chuckled. Well, it's a beast. Even our best student struggles with it. Playing Chopin is not for the faint of heart." "I don't know," Naomi replied quietly, her voice faltering slightly on the last word, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of a truth that had been hidden for too long. He nodded, half to her, half to himself. "All right. If anyone gives you any trouble, come see me." She nodded. When he left, Naomi remained where she was, her gaze wandering over the notes, then the keys, then the fabric in her hand, and with such reverence that it could hardly be called a movement. She wiped the surface of the piano as if it were a relic from her own past. Her breathing was uneven, her heart beating louder than it had in years, and before she walked away, she quietly closed the sheet music, her fingers lingering on the edge of the page as if touching something sacred. The next morning, the Ellington campus buzzed with attention that vibrated in the air like an unresolved chord. Flyers taped to glass doors and notice boards in bright bold letters announced the upcoming honors showcase. The kind of night where scholarships are born and futures decided, and as students paced the corridors clutching sheet music and coffee cups, their voices tight with anxiety and ambition, Naomi Ellis moved silently through their panic, pushing her cart of supplies past. Whispered conversations and nervous rehearsals, unnoticed as always, except this time the words she overheard struck deeper, closer, because they were about Chopin, and about Raymond Allen, and about the ballade in G minor. The very piece that still echoed in the quietest parts of her mind like a secret she wasn't supposed to remember. "I can't get the left-hand arpeggios clean," one student hissed. "Did you hear who's coming from the Livingston Foundation?" another asked. "Barrett picked the Chopin for Ray," someone muttered. "That's suicide." Naomi said nothing, of course, she never did, but her eyes paused on the door of Studio 5, where she had seen Ray practicing late into the evening, brow drenched, posture tense. Each note of Chopin's delicate violence attacked with a kind of desperation that impressed, but didn't move, because for all his precision, there was something hollow in the sound, like he was trying to conquer the piece instead of surrendering to it, and Naomi knew, with a certainty that came not from memory but from muscle, that no one wins a fight with Chopin. That afternoon, Dr. Barrett summoned her to the office, a space built more like a glass trophy case than a workplace, all sharp angles and clean lines, filled with plaques that gleamed more than her eyes ever did. And Naomi stood quietly as a thick stack of marked-up papers was shoved across the desk toward her. "These are the programs," Barrett said, not even pretending to meet her gaze. "Format and print them by morning. And don't screw up this time. I still haven't forgotten the typo in the box suite last semester." Naomi nodded, lifting the sheets without comment. Barrett paused, then added sharply, "The Chopin goes last. Don't change the order. Don't touch the margins." Naomi murmured, understood, though her eyes lingered on the music too long, just long enough for Barrett to look up and notice. "You recognize it?" she asked, her tone suddenly suspicious. Naomi blinked. "It's beautiful." "It's brutal," Barrett corrected coldly. "Half our faculty can't manage it. Ray's been prepping it for 6 weeks. Let's hope he doesn't choke again." Naomi left the office without another word, but she didn't go home. That night, the building emptied slowly, one light at a time, one footstep at a time, and Naomi remained, not because anyone asked, not because she had something left to clean, but because the silence called to her more than the noise of the day ever could. And when she stepped into Studio 3 and saw the grand piano with its lid still propped open, a single light burning above it like an invitation or a dare, and the score of Chopin's ballade left abandoned in the rush to leave, she didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't rationalize, she just sat down. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed her gloves. She flexed her fingers, not to stretch, but to remember. And then, like no time had passed, like 5 years hadn't broken her and buried her and turned her into someone people stepped around instead of toward, she played. Not the full piece, only the opening, that hesitant, haunting first phrase that rises like smoke and refuses to settle, the melody that hovers between sorrow and defiance, between memory and resistance, and her touch was soft but clear, careful but knowing, like someone handling something precious that once belonged to her completely. In the hallway, Professor Rosen stopped mid-step, the stack of papers in his arms slowly dipping as he stepped closer to the glass and watched the woman he'd never truly seen sit at the piano and pour music into the air without hesitation, without effort, without anyone's permission. Inside, Naomi didn't see him. She didn't see anything but the keys, didn't feel anything but the weightless sensation of remembering who she had been, of touching the sound that had once carried her to Vienna, to Paris, to disaster, and now back to this moment, quiet and heavy and perfect. She finished the phrase. Her hands dropped softly to her lap. She didn't cry. But the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, aching, undeniable, the kind of silence that only comes when something long buried finally exhales. Behind the glass, Rosen stepped back, face unreadable, and vanished into the dark without a word. The next morning, Naomi arrived before sunrise, as she always did, the building still dark and hushed, with only the faint hum of the cleaning machines echoing through the corridors and the scent of lemon oil rising from freshly polished floors. And yet there was something different in the air, a tension, a curiosity, the kind of quiet shift that happens when someone who was never seen begins, ever so slightly, to be noticed, because as Naomi placed the stack of perfectly printed showcase programs on Dr. Barrett's desk and turned to disappear into her usual invisibility, she felt eyes follow her, glances that lingered a second too long, students who paused mid-conversation as she passed, unsure why her face seemed suddenly unfamiliar in its familiarity, and when the cellist Vanessa approached her near the stairwell with a tone more hesitant than rude. Naomi understood that the silence of the night before had not stayed in the shadows where it was born. "Hey," the girl had said, brow furrowed, "were you playing last night?" "In Studio 3. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She simply offered the kind of smile that invited no further questions. a small lift of the mouth that said both yes and no, and then she stepped past, her shoes making no sound. Her hands returning to their work as if nothing had shifted, though deep down she felt it, the slow unraveling of a secret she had tried for years to keep buried under rags and silence. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had turned sharp, like static in the walls. Dr. Barrett's instructions were snappier than usual, her posture taut as a coiled string, and when she called Naomi to the main rehearsal hall at exactly 3:15 p.m., her tone was brittle enough to crack the glass in the trophy cases that lined the corridor, and Naomi, wiping her palms on her cloth without understanding why she had been summoned, stepped inside the large sunlit room where several professors were, gathered near the piano, their expressions tight with preoccupied distraction until they saw her. "Miss Ellis," Barrett called, not looking up from her clipboard. "Come here." Naomi approached slowly, her heart thudding not with fear, but with the unmistakable scent of something foul in the air, not violence, but humiliation, planned and waiting like a trap disguised as a conversation. Barrett gestured lazily to the score resting open on the piano lid. "Since you seem to have such a strong appreciation for Chopin," she said, voice smooth like glass before it shatters, "perhaps you'd like to explain what's wrong with this passage." Naomi hesitated, caught between instinct and logic, between staying quiet as she always had, or speaking the truth she had carried silently through years of applause and abandonment. "I didn't mean," she started, but Barrett cut her off. "You lingered by this score long enough yesterday," she continued, louder now. "Surely you must have an opinion." Her voice rose, not just in pitch but in intent, drawing the attention of the other professors, two of whom turned with poorly disguised smirks, as if this moment were a show, and Naomi the act they didn't pay to see but were happy to mock. Naomi looked down at the music, then stepped slightly forward, her voice low, measured, steady. "That section, it's rushed. Ray pushes the tempo too hard, especially before the modulation. If he let the melody breathe, the line would rise more naturally." There was a beat of silence, a brief hush like a breath before a slap. "Oh," Barrett said, her voice rising into a sharper register, "so now you're giving performance notes?" "That's what we're doing." Naomi didn't answer. "I asked you to format a program, Ms. Ellis," she went on, each syllable landing like a blow, "not critique the repertoire. You clean floors. You do not interpret Chopin." A chuckle broke from one of the men by the window, quick and mean. Naomi's hands remained at her sides. Her chin didn't drop. She said nothing more. Barrett stared at her for a moment, and in her expression was the pure, unfiltered satisfaction of someone who believes they've reminded the world of its proper order. "Is there anything else?" Naomi asked quietly, and Barrett, lips curling into the coldest version of a smile, gave the slightest shake of her head. "No. Get back to your duties." Naomi turned and walked away, but before the door closed behind her, she heard a professor mutter just loud enough, "Some people forget their place the moment you look at them." The words followed her like oil, clinging to her skin long after she'd retreated to the service hallway and sat in the supply closet, her hands resting on her knees, the same hands that once drew gasps from concert halls. The same hands that had trembled on stage in Prague, in Milan, in D.C., but now held nothing but quiet fury and the ragged ache of dignity denied. She didn't cry. She sat, breathed, and let the memory of Chopin's ballade unfold in her mind with every note she no longer played, not because she couldn't, but because the world had decided it no longer expected her to. And somewhere in that stillness, like a chord struck deep in her chest, a resolve began to rise, slow, warm, undeniable, the kind of resolve that does not seek revenge, only truth. The day of the Ellington Honors Showcase arrived with the weight of expectation pressing down on every hallway, every rehearsal room, every breath that passed between hopeful students and calculating faculty. And while tuxedos were steamed and pianos tuned and programs handed to arriving donors in designer heels and tailored suits, Naomi moved through it all in silence, carrying chairs, adjusting lights, wiping down surfaces that gleamed brighter than the people who ignored her every morning. For 6 straight weeks, backstage was chaos, breathless, nervous, fragile, the kind of energy that clings to your skin and makes you feel like anything could shatter with the wrong note or a glance from the wrong professor. And as Naomi placed bottled waters beside the green room mirror, she noticed Raymond Allen sitting alone, his sheet music trembling slightly in his hands, his fingers twitching against his thigh like they didn't belong to him. She didn't approach him at first. She knew how musicians prepared, how solitude sometimes calmed the storm better than words. But when she saw him close his eyes and whisper something to himself, a sentence that cracked slightly on the last word, she stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "Raymond, are you all right?" He opened his eyes but didn't focus, his expression pale and unfocused as he muttered, "They want fire, but I can't even feel my hands." She knelt slowly, her hand resting gently on the edge of the bench, not touching him, not crowding him, just there, grounding him with her presence, with the same calm she'd once used on herself in dressing rooms across Europe, before the car crash that broke her body and stole 5 years of her voice. "Close your eyes," she said. "Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 8 again." And as he followed her rhythm, the tremor in his fingers softened just slightly, enough for him to clutch the sheet music tighter, though not steady enough to believe he'd be able to play Chopin's Ballade the way it deserved. Not in front of donors, not in front of faculty who didn't forgive weakness. Just then, Dr. Barrett entered the room like a storm in heels, whispering urgently to Professor Rosen, who had appeared beside her, both of them speaking too low to hear, but with enough tension in their posture to fill the room with a single truth: something had gone wrong. Naomi stood, stepped back into the shadows as always, and watched as Barrett turned toward Raymond, forced a smile that cracked at the edges, and said, "We need you on stage in 5. I can't," he whispered, voice tight, barely audible. Barrett's face drained. "What? My fingers. They are numb. I can't," he tried again, but his hands betrayed him, shaking uncontrollably. "Then who the hell is going to play Chopin?" she snapped, forgetting who was listening. Professor Rosen rubbed his brow, muttering, "We can't cancel the Ballade, not with the Livingston Foundation in the audience. It's the centerpiece. That piece is why they came." Madame Renaud, the retired French pedagogue who had once taught in Paris and now occasionally coached students at Ellington, appeared behind them, her eyes sharp despite her age. "No one else prepared the Ballade," she said grimly. "Not in this program. Not even the faculty." In that moment, when all heads turned and all options collapsed into nothing, Naomi stepped forward, her voice calm, clear, deliberate, as if she were announcing a truth that had always existed. "I know the piece." There was silence, not just quiet, but a full stop in breath and thought, as if no one could process the idea that the woman with the mop and the name no one remembered had just volunteered to perform a composition that terrified their best student. Barrett's mouth twisted into something between disbelief and offense. "Excuse me." Naomi didn't flinch. "I know Chopin's Ballade No. 1. I can play it. All of it." Rosen chuckled, but it came out nervous. "This isn't the time for delusion, Ms. Ellis." "I'm not deluded," she replied evenly, her eyes never leaving Barrett's. "Have you even seen a real piano score?" Barrett hissed, voice low and venomous. "I've lived inside them," Naomi answered, and though her words were soft, they landed like thunder. Madame Renaud's expression shifted, something flickering behind her eyes as she stepped forward, tilting her head slowly. "What did you say your name was again?" But Barrett cut her off. "This is absurd. We are not putting a janitor on stage in front of our top donors and risking our entire reputation on some fantasy she's built in her head while scrubbing keys." "You don't have a pianist," Naomi said plainly. "You either let the piece be heard, or you explain to the foundation why it isn't." Rosen shook his head. "We can't risk it. She's never played in front of us. We don't know anything about her." "You've seen her for 6 weeks," Madame Renaud said softly. "You just never looked." Barrett's face flushed with fury, her voice dropping to a whisper laced with warning. "If you humiliate this institution, you'll be fired before your hands leave the keys." Naomi only nodded once, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the thrill of what waited just beyond the curtain. The auditorium was packed, every velvet seat filled with students in stiff collars and faculty in designer black and donors in pearls and polished shoes, their conversations a soft blur of money, expectations, and the quiet hunger to witness brilliance. And backstage, where the lights cast long shadows and the tension clung to the walls like heat, Naomi stood still in a sea of motion, unnoticed, until everything went wrong. Raymond Allen was supposed to close the showcase, the final act, the masterpiece, the one thing the foundation requested specifically: Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece that carried weight far beyond its notes. And when someone came sprinting toward Dr. Barrett, whispering urgently in her ear, The color drained from her face before she even reached the green room, where Raymond sat hunched on a bench, his hands pressed between his knees, his breath shallow, his body frozen. Not in laziness or nerves, but in full collapse, panic attack, the real kind, not the dramatic kind students fake to avoid juries. I can't feel my fingers, he whispered, eyes wide, voice cracking. They're numb. I can't. Barrett's heels clapped against the tile as she paced. This is a disaster, she hissed to Rosen. The Livingston people came for this piece. If he doesn't play, there's no backup, Rosen muttered. No one else prepared it. Madame Renaud entered, her expression drawn tight with concern. We must tell the audience something. A medical emergency. We delay the performance. The donors will walk out, Barrett snapped. You know how they are. We lose this moment. We lose the funding. No one looked at Naomi. No one asked. But she stepped forward anyway. I can play it, she said softly. The silence that followed was like the sharp inhale before an earthquake. Barrett turned first, her mouth already twisted into disbelief. I'm sorry. What? I know the piece, Naomi said, louder now, her spine straighter than it had been in years. I've played it. Professor Rosen stared. You mean, you've heard it? No, she replied, and her voice didn't shake. I've performed it. All of it. Barrett's laugh was short, sharp, cold. This is absurd. But Madame Renaud tilted her head, narrowing her eyes. Your name? Ellis. That's not your full name, is it? Naomi didn't answer. You think you can just walk onto a stage, Barrett said, stepping closer now, her voice dropping to a low hiss, in front of donors, students, faculty, and play one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire? Dressed like that? With no rehearsal? No validation? I don't need validation, Naomi replied, calm, almost quiet. Just a piano. Rosen whispered something to Barrett, something about time, and no options, and the stage manager appeared at the door with panic in his eyes, whispering that the audience was getting restless, the foundation was watching, they were going to leave. Barrett turned back to Naomi, her voice clipped, venomous. If you embarrass this school, I'll make sure you're escorted off campus before your hands even leave the keys. You understand me? I do. Do you even know the score? She asked. Naomi looked her in the eye. I won't need it. No one spoke as she followed the stage manager toward the wings, her footsteps quiet but steady, her fingers flexing at her sides, not out of fear, but to feel them, to remind herself they were hers again. In the darkness of the wing, she waited. Then, Barrett walked out to the center of the stage, face composed, voice formal. Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, Mr. Raymond Allen will be unable to perform this evening. However, we are fortunate to present a substitute performer who will be playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Please welcome Naomi Ellis. The applause was hesitant, scattered, polite, uncertain. When Naomi stepped into the light, there was no recognition, just confusion. A woman in a janitor's uniform walking toward the Steinway in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in the school's orbit. Someone in the back laughed, quietly, nervously, unsure if this was a stunt or a punishment. But Naomi didn't look at them. She walked to the bench like she had 1,000 times before, adjusted the height without thought, tucked her foot under the pedal just so, and placed her hands on the keys. And when she began, not timidly, not cautiously, but with clarity and force and command, the entire room changed. The first phrase hit like a storm wrapped in silk, the sound rich and full and startling in its intimacy, and every head turned, every murmur stopped, because what they heard was not a fluke or a trick or some underdog novelty, it was mastery, it was control. It was soul, the kind of playing that rewrites the air around it. Naomi played like someone who knew what it meant to fall and rebuild, someone who had lost everything except the sound in her hands, and as the melody built and the room held its breath, one thing became undeniable. This was not a cleaning woman. This was a concert pianist. As the final notes rang out across the hall, not fumbled, not rushed, but shaped with precision and patience and something deeper, something only time and pain could teach, a silence followed so absolute that even the chandeliers seemed to stop shimmering. A breathless stillness stretched across hundreds of faces, none of which looked the way they had when she entered, because the woman in the gray uniform no longer existed in their eyes, replaced by something they couldn't name but couldn't deny. And then, as if struck by a single invisible chord, the entire auditorium erupted into sound, not just applause, but an eruption, thunderous, rising from the floor, echoing from the rafters, raw and unfiltered, students leaping to their feet, donors clapping with wide eyes, someone yelling brava, from the second row, and behind them, one man in a navy suit stood with tears in his eyes, not blinking, not moving, just staring like he'd seen something holy. Naomi sat still, her hands resting gently in her lap, her eyes closed, not drinking in the applause but letting it pass through her like water over stone, because this moment was not about praise, it was about release. About finally shedding the silence that had wrapped itself around her for 5 years like a second skin. And when she finally stood and turned to bow, it was with the calm grace of someone who didn't need validation to know she had just spoken in the only language that ever truly belonged to her. Dr. Barrett remained frozen in her front row seat, her mouth parted slightly, her knuckles white where they clutched her clipboard, and beside her, Professor Rosen had long since given up pretending to adjust his glasses, now holding them in one hand like a relic. While Madame Renaud sat forward, tears on her lashes and both hands clasped over her mouth. Naomi gave a second, smaller bow, then a third, and as she turned to leave the stage, Dr. Barrett stood suddenly and approached the microphone, her face stretched into something that tried to resemble composure but failed under the weight of what had just happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice unsteady despite the microphone, "I believe we owe you an explanation." The room quieted again, this time not out of confusion, but anticipation. Barrett turned slowly toward Naomi, who had paused just off-center, still in the light. "Would you care," she asked, trying to sound formal, "to introduce yourself properly, Ms. Ellis, or should I say, Ms. Curtis?" A ripple passed through the audience, audible, electric, and then came the whisper, growing from row to row like a wave breaking, "Curtis." "Naomi Curtis," and then louder, "Curtis? As in, the Curtis?" Naomi stepped forward again, not hesitating, not smiling, just ready. "Yes," she said simply, her voice clear, her posture grounded. "I am Naomi Curtis." Gasps followed, not dramatized, not polite, but stunned, and in the fourth row, someone whispered she was supposed to headline Berlin before the accident. Another said, "I thought she disappeared." Barrett, trying to regain control, pushed forward. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why one of the most celebrated pianists of her generation has spent the last 6 weeks wiping down music stands and folding chairs?" Naomi turned her head slightly, looking directly at her, and when she answered, her voice held no resentment, only truth. 5 years ago, I suffered a spinal injury. Nerve damage. Doctors said I'd never play again. I didn't want to prove them wrong on a stage. I wanted to find out, quietly, if the music was still in me, without applause, without expectations, without pressure. Ellington let me be invisible. That's what I needed. Madame Renaud stepped toward the mic before Barrett could respond. "But why didn't you tell us who you were?" she asked, gently, genuinely, and Naomi's eyes softened as she replied. "Would you have believed me?" The question didn't need an answer, not from Barrett, not from anyone else. Professor Rosen stepped forward slowly, eyes lowered, voice low. "I'd like to apologize," he said, almost inaudible, "for what I didn't see." Naomi nodded once. "We all only see what we expect to." In the audience, a silver-haired man stood, sharp suit, foundation pin on his lapel. "Miss Curtis," he said, voice deep and authoritative, "I'm David Livingston, director of the Livingston Foundation. We came tonight hoping to fund new talent. But what we witnessed was something far rarer, a return. If you consider working with our scholars directly, I'd be honored to sponsor a full masterclass series." Before Naomi could reply, Barrett jumped in, her voice suddenly warm, falsely bright. "The Ellington School would be thrilled to offer Ms. Curtis an official artist-in-residence position. We've actually been discussing it internally." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You've been discussing it?" Barrett hesitated. It was preliminary. Naomi didn't press. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, every lie, every dismissal, every smirk and whispered insult collapsed under the weight of the truth now standing in front of them. Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance? Share your experience in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story about fairness, click the like button and subscribe to hear more inspiring stories that remind us what really matters in life. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know.